Hey guys, Chris here from Work to Game, Gaming Kinda, and now Gaming Kinda TV over on Facebook as well. That means that if you are watching this, it is October 13th or later, so I can finally share everything we learned from the media tour, but I do have a couple of disclaimers. First of all, Yoshi P opened his statement to us by saying a thank you to the medical staff over the last few years, and I would like to echo his thoughts. You've been asked of a lot in the fight over the last few years, and if 14 can help be a way to connect with friends or relax after a long day, then I am happy that I can share what we now know about Endwalker coming up very soon, and the devs hope that in some small way that can be a thank you and a place for you to enjoy and appreciate all that you do. Second, a disclaimer about the content itself. We were given brief access to a development build of Endwalker. Any footage I used from this time is development footage and will be labeled as such. Any of this is subject to change, any tooltips, any potencies, anything I show as they put the finishing touches on Endwalker may be subject to adjustments. Now, when I look at the things that affect all of the tanks, during the Job Action Live Letter, a statement was made that defensives used at optimal times by main tanks and even off tanks would benefit the tank. I didn't see this directly in the content that we were allowed to try at the media tour, but it could possibly refer to a change in how mitigation is used in encounters by making mitigation windows more meaningful or just making things hit harder. We didn't get a chance to do a lot of level 90 content, and so we'll have to see what that means. This statement still rings around in my head the way it was stated. Do jobs, just the way their changes in mitigation work? We've seen changes to things in the past, and I hadn't heard a statement quite like this for past expansions. So either I'm misremembering the way they've always presented these changes in the past, or I'm just not understanding quite yet what this means in how this is drastically different than any other time we've added or changed defensives moving into an expansion. The second statement was that ranged abilities no longer break combos for tanks or melee jobs. This is massive. Having tried every single job during the media tour, I can tell you that if I broke a combo, I now knew for a fact it was my fault. This gives me the ability to aim to improve at a pace that is entirely my own, and without the added layer of wondering, did the encounter make me mess up? Was there something weird about an ability that was called for breaking a combo? Trying to keep my uptime up with these ranged combos as I move out, I now get to make my own choices on what skills I prioritize within certain burst windows, and everything I do as far as completing combos, whether or not I am using a ranged attack, uptime is something I can now maintain while also trying to complete combos, which is something this expansion seems to be heavily leaning into across a number of jobs. This is a factor that has bugged me throughout Shadowbringers as I've aimed to improve as a player, and I think this is a wonderful change moving forward. Next, there was a statement that the parity between physical and magical attributes was different, and it was a carryover from the A Realm Reborn development, and that has now been fixed and will mean that physical abilities potencies would need to be lowered if the ability was to be doing the same damage relative to Shadowbringers. So behind the scenes coefficients, these things that we weren't really seeing outright represented in the UI cleanly and openly like potency is in a tooltip, will make it easier moving forward. But keep in mind that as we see potency adjustments, this is different than the stat squish, as we see potency adjustments, an increase in its strength might mean that the potency stays the same or goes up, and a decrease in an ability's strength, something for it to be nerfed, would need to be lowered even beyond what this is calling for. So as we compare potencies, when we talk about the fact that layered on top of this we have an attribute stat squish, everything's going to work just a little bit differently moving forward. The biggest thing that I can say we can take away from everything we can see right now, besides nerf and buff, is how do abilities compare to each other? Are there abilities that went up while other abilities went down within the same class? And does this help us understand where the importance of a combo action matters versus does the ability get as penalized when it's not used as a combo action? And that'll give us more of their mindset moving forward. And then, of course, as we see, theory crafters get into actual rotations, that will help us understand what this means as far as the way we play. And all of that will be useful when we get into the context of the game itself this November. Now, the stat squish is something independent of this, so any damage, any flyover text you see in any videos anywhere, that is, of course, going on. So remember that that's just going to feel different. I actually didn't feel any... I don't really feel the stat squish is something that felt any different than what I would say at Mediator footage going into Shadowbringers, which was not filled with a stat squish. The potencies that are all shown are still subject to potential adjustments, so we are looking at the overall mentalities of what we learned, knowing that there might be still a few moving parts as they get down to the wire with what they can still change. I don't remember them stating exactly when the build date of our Mediator build is from, but obviously from when that build was finalized to prep it for us to the build that releases on November 19th for early access to Endwalker, that will be a window that they could still change things. And lastly, looking at all of the tanks, let's look at role actions. When looking at the 4 tanks, while many abilities such as tank stance, ranged actions, gap closers, and even to some degree things like invulns can be similar, these 7 actions are literally shared. They're identical in every single way across the role and have not changed at all moving into Endwalker. Rampart, still a defensive. It's a flat 20% mitigation for 20 seconds. I felt a little softer in the one dungeon they let us try, but that could be that I was playing on a character without my proper keybind, so I was a little bit off. It could be that our healer, who was trying and adjusting incredibly well, was playing on Sage, so her total playtime adjusting to that class could not have been that much. Considering she is a healer that can clear E12, she still only had the job for a couple minutes, basically, before we went into the dungeon. A lack of familiarity with the encounters and anything that's going to work a little bit different in the way the encounters are designed. This is also only slightly insightful because the dungeon was not level 90 content, much less things like raids, trials, or even crazier savage, so it'll be hard to show if mitigation will feel worse or better this time around until we get into actual content. Low blow is still a 5-second stun. I would love to see this used more in encounters. That's not something we can know until we see the content of Endwalker. I just personally think that things like dungeons, which we did get to see one dungeon as well as some open world content, that's a sliver of what Endwalker could offer, and I would love to see this used more as we get into raids, alliance raids, definitely dungeons. Provoke, enmity, threat, hate. Shadowbringers turn this on its head with the shift to tank stance, and that does not appear to have been a big focus of what we are seeing moving into Endwalker. We're largely going to see that the same as Shadowbringers. It's the same 30-second cooldown, so if anything feels different as far as your ability to shift between main tank and off tank, especially as we talk about tank swaps where you're trying to rotate which tank is in charge, that's all going to likely feel different from the rotation side of things, which some jobs rotations this expansion changed a lot more than others. Interject, like low blow, I honestly just hope it gets used more. I think interrupts are not nearly used as often in this game as I would like them to be. I think they're something that adds an unpredictable additional task you need to do in your rotation, especially in content like dungeons, which don't have a harder mode available. Casual beginner players would just get hit by it. No big deal. They just have to pull slower because they're getting hit by extra stuff. Players that are willing to optimize that a little bit have one additional thing that they can practice doing. Knowing that dungeons are also something that we regularly outgear, we regularly don't need the gear from, and we're running them for roulettes to get tomes, this would be something that I think would add a lot of variety to dungeons. Just stuns, interrupts, things like that would be more intriguing in my mind. I don't see anything here saying that interject is going to be used any differently than it is now. Now, reprisal has not been changed at all, but is honestly just a god-tier ability. So if this is your first time hearing of reprisal, please use it, starting now. It doesn't matter if it's still Shadowbringers, use it. Endwalker tanks will be able to pull faster. Our ranged abilities, my Warrior ranged ability got further. Gap closers on everybody but Warrior went up to match Warrior's 20-yard range, as well as almost all of the other jobs are getting something to help with movement. So we could very easily see tanks moving into double or triple pulls restricted only by the walls that dungeons put up. And this, when you get a big AoE pull in, reduces all nearby enemies by 10%. So it's just a flat reduction in damage. And you pair that with arm's length. It hasn't changed as well, but it is also an incredible thing for AoE pulling. It is likely the most understood ability in this section for new tanks or players coming over from another game who are simply misreading the terminology. In raids, this is usually used for anti-knockback, so I think we have that pretty well in hand as a community. It, however, works very similar to reprisal in dungeons when you pull big. It adds slow to enemies. In 14, the ability to reduce somebody's speed from movement is called heavy. Heavy gets placed on you, heavy gets placed on a mob, whatever. Heavy is what adjusts the movement speed. But if you are looking at swing speed, this is what slow means. And so when you have a lot of guys swinging at you repeatedly, this slows down how often they swing, which is going to reduce the number of times you're getting hit per second in these big pulls. So that's arm's length is still an incredible thing to use in dungeons. It's just you're not using it typically for the anti-knockback. You'd be using it for this ability to slow down how often a bunch of little guys hit you. Lastly, Shirk. Didn't change. I've never really needed this ability outside of Savage or Extreme, so unless the tanks are having to swap back and forth who's main tank in a tank swap mechanic, it's not an ability that I see typically used very much. It doesn't seem it's changed, so until we can get Savage, we won't really know how it feels switching threat versus this expansion. Obviously, everybody's learned to manage to clear all the content just fine. And that's the role actions. So nothing crazy for how this is going to impact any one of the tanks, much less all of the tanks. But I don't worry for individual tank changes being something that's going to feel like you don't know how to play your tank. We don't yet know everything that's going to feel different from playing Shadowbringers at level 80 versus Endwalker at 90. But as a general rule, I think when we look at the tanks as a whole, I don't see anything here in the broad category of tanks that's going to drastically change the way you play. It's mostly going to be in the individual changes that change your rotation, where you feel that your identity shifts any at all per tank. So when discussing Warrior, I've got a couple of sections I'd like to break this into, and we will start with what did not change. Now, the Warrior changes across the board are pretty substantial. So in the context of everything else, these will still feel like changes. And before I do all of this, I'd like to note there is a level 84 trait that was obviously in effect on our level 90 characters on the Mediator, and that increases potencies. And so I'm not exactly sure what the potencies are pre-level 84, so anybody that's trying to do theory crafting for synced stuff based on this information, I just want you to note that. First up is heavy swing. Keep in mind this should have gone down, and maybe did. With the parity adjustment between physical and magical, this should have gone down. So by keeping the potency the same on these tooltips, it's actually a buff to what this does as your first hit. The second is Defiance. Enmity on its own doesn't feel like it's made much of a change. It seems like they're pretty happy with where it's at in Shadowbringers, but because of the way all of our classes change as far as their burst windows and their rotations, your ability to kind of pick up and maintain threat when you and another tank are really close may feel a little bit different, but for clean swaps that should be identical. Thrill of Battle and Vengeance. Now, I'm not exactly sure what they meant when they said that using mitigation correctly would act as a buff, but a lot of mitigation abilities as abilities did change, and these are the two that did not on Warrior. And so I'm not exactly sure what that statement meant, and I look forward to kind of finding out what that means in the context of maybe rating or higher end content where they meant that to take place, but it was nothing that we got to test that really helps me understand that comment. And then Infuriate. Gauge generation is just different across the board, but Infuriate on its own didn't change. But the way we use Gauge, the way we generate Gauge, even the way we use Infuriate will change, and you'll see that as we go through the rest of these sections. Now, the next section is what got weaker. Now, keep in mind that this is with the parity adjustment, so they warned us that physical abilities would have a potency drop, and that would actually result in the same damage because there's a back-end thing they referred to as parity that acts like some sort of coefficient that was instilled from ARR, and now that they brought that up for all physical abilities will need to have less potency on the tooltip in order to result in the same amount of damage, and then of course that's all affected by the squish to attributes. But what's interesting here is the percentage reductions are not consistent. First up is Overpower, dropping from 130 down to 110. This is a 15% reduction. We don't know what the parity adjustment was, so that's just kind of our baseline. Inner Beast, however, reduces from 350 down to 330, which is only a 5% reduction, and then it gets upgraded to Fell Cleave, which drops from 590 to 460, which is a 22% reduction. Now we have an additional new set of abilities on the bar to augment the way we use Fell Cleave, called Chaotic Cyclone and Primal Rend. So we'll talk about those when we get to those sections, but that's a massive drop for the actual iconic ability that is Fell Cleave. Last up is Steel Cyclone and its counterpart Decimate. Steel Cyclone going down by that 22% reduction from 220 to 170, and Decimate going down by nearly as much at a 20% reduction from 250 down to 200. So it feels like AoE really got hit there, but once again, we've got more things coming down on the pipe that will increase the amount of AoE throughput that you have. So we'll have to see how that feels, but I thought this was interesting, and I know there are people that will ask what got weaker, but I just want to keep in mind that in the overall feel of Warrior, it did not feel weaker at all, and if anything, I feel stronger than I was, and as I look through all these changes, I think that people are going to be really excited about Warrior for Endwalker. Now for the single biggest, and in my opinion, most important section coming out of the media tour, and then of course we'll get into the new stuff, is what changed. Now I'm going in order of level unlocked, kind of, except I'll pair the upgraded version where there is one, but we have a lot to go over here. Before I do, I want to remind you there is a level 84 trait that is increasing potencies on some abilities, so I'm not exactly sure what the potencies on those abilities were pre-84, because I have only screenshots from being at level 90. Now Maim went from a base potency from 100 up to 130, but the combo portion of this actually dropped from 320 to 280. That's a 30% increase when used incorrectly, and a 12% drop when used correctly as a combo action. Now Storm's Path is up from 100 to 120. That's a 20% increase. We're seeing that across Storm's Eye as well. The combo action, however, is dropping from 420 down to 400. Now, this being such a big number, it's a big drop of 20 potency, but over a number that big, it's only a 5% reduction. And what's important to note here is that our 3-part combo from Shadowbringers was 940 potency. We expected physical potencies to go down to maintain the same damage, so we don't know what this means as far as total damage in Endwalker. It's not that big of a drop. It's a 6% overall drop to 880 potency. So it's not a massive drop as long as you are completing the full combo. You've got to get that third part off. Of course, the difference between Storm's Eye and Storm Path being the exact same, where you're getting the additional Beast Gauge, the additional heal for using Storm's Path, but you do want to maintain that Storm's Eye buff uptime, of course, with the new name, the Surging Tempest, to allow for the fact that our AoE combos will be also getting the ability to generate that and save you from having to put Storm's Eye up when you go into an AoE pull. You can just open with an AoE opener. Berserk and Inner Release. The cooldowns went from 90 seconds down to 60 seconds. As a result of you using them more often, they're only going to extend your Storm's Eye buff, which has a new name called Surging Tempest, by 10 seconds instead of 15 seconds. Remember, you're going to be doing a lot more of them. And instead of it being a 10-second burst, which was a lot of what drove skill speed, it is now a 30-second burst. But during that 30 seconds, you are going to only get 3 charges, which will make you have 3 Beast Gauge costing actions for free. We'll have a brand new ability that we'll be doing in that window, and we have some other abilities that no longer cost gauge. So this is effectively 3 Fell Cleaves or Decimates. But we'll be talking about some other abilities kind of and how this changes here as we go on. Now, Tomahawk, the potency plummeted from 140 down to 100, but honestly, I think it's still a net win because it no longer breaks combos and can now be used at 20 yalms instead of 15, meaning you are likely to use more Tomahawks per encounter, so I don't really care about the 40% nerf here. It's honestly just a net win because it's more Tomahawks. Focus more on uptime. More. Holmgang is by far one of the things that's going to make Warrior just tell every other tank to sit all the way down. Duration extended from 8 seconds to the same 10 seconds as everybody else. We're not seeing any downside to that. That's just a straight up buff. Now, Mithril Tempest, the AoE combo ender, now is going to be granting that Surging Tempest, but also noticeably has a 25% drop in potency. And so seeing the AoE potencies drop across the board, this is pretty big, because this means your 2-part AoE combo was a full 330 before for just 2 parts, and that dropped all the way to 260, which is right around that like 21% as a drop. So it's a lot bigger than its single target counterpart, but I will say the counterpoint to that is that in the next section, we'll go over the fact that we are adding new ways to drop AoE into your AoE total rotation. So your 2-part combo is simply going to be one component of that. We are adding whole new potency in the next section where we talk about the new abilities. Raw Intuition, this will be replaced with a level 82 ability in the next section. So a lot of the change around this is geared towards what that means in the next section, but I wanted to note it here. Equilibrium, now in addition to the 1200 potency, will also grant a 15-second heal over time at 200 potency, beginning at level 84. Onslaught is now free, and at level 80, we are going to go from 2 charges of it to 3 charges of it. You feel incredibly fast, especially in a dungeon where you are trying to change targets in a boss fight, maybe to get out of something, keep that uptime up. It feels really, really good. You've got Onslaught for days. I was a little concerned that they were making the gap closers one more thing that fell to homogenization, but overall, I think this feels like a really good thing and makes me feel like this berserk beast that's just chasing things down. Healers, you just gotta keep up. Upheaval. Dropping from 450 to 350 is that 22% reduction, which feels like the high end on these. But it's also now free, and we're going to get an AoE version that we're going to talk about when we talk about the new skills. Shake It Off, now at 76, will add a 300% potency heal. So it's just better. From the day we roll in, we will all be level 80s if you're going through Endwalker as a warrior main like I am, and this will just be in effect. Nascent Flash. This just works differently. Kind of. Now it's going to restore health for attacking instead of being attacked, which will help you as an off-tank. Your target will gain health based on this instead of damage received, and then Stem the Tide will now be added at level 82 and level 76, which really only affects people doing T. Now, what's new? We got some new abilities here. Bloodwetting is going to replace Raw Intuition at 82. It's now going to grant the Nascent Flash's Stem the Flow, as well as a 400 potency shield. Orogeny is literally just AoE Upheaval. Reminder, these 2 abilities are free now. You want to be using these every single time they're up. You already wanted to be doing that because it was an efficient use of Gauge. Now it's just good. Just use it all the time. Primal Rend is literally Super Fell Cleave with a little bit of Decimate on it, all in one. This is something you're going to be using every single inner release. This does not consume one of your 3 stacks of inner release, but must be used during inner release. So you'll mix it into those 3 stacks. Now, Inner Chaos and Chaotic Cyclone replace Fell Cleave and Decimate every time you pop Infuriate. Using the 50 gauge from Infuriate on them correctly drops the cooldown of the next Infuriate by 5 seconds. So as long as you're not using Infuriate to give you more gauge than you can hold, meaning you have 50 or more already on the bar, this is just a way of getting more Infuriates every encounter for using it correctly. These got massive reductions from 920 to 650 and 400 down to 320, some of the largest percentage drops that we've seen. Now overall, I think that this is just a lot of buffs. The new stuff feels amazing. The Primal Rend, it felt so good on the dummy, and then the dungeon that they gave us access to was not high enough level that I had Primal Rend. And then it was like, well, where did it go? I just practiced, and it's gone. So immediately you're going to miss having Primal Rend every single time you sink down. It's phenomenal. I think in general, I feel just beastlier. I feel faster. I feel like I'm charging into things. I'm constantly getting to Fell Cleave and Decimate because we have those more often inner releases. I feel meatier. I feel like a lot of these changes actually benefit me if I play correctly. And then people who are breaking combos, that initial action got a little bit of a buff, but overall you're losing a lot using things correctly. So it does feel like the people who are at the absolute skill floor, they're not getting their combinations at all. It feels like there's just more forgiveness there. So it feels like the bottom got brought up for anybody that is in a group with somebody who is learning Warrior for the first time. It, however, on the opposite side of things, feels like the gap between that brand new Warrior and what is theoretically possible is now bigger than ever before. So the total amount of change between your skill floor, which got easier, to your skill ceiling, which got way higher, I feel is a much bigger learning range, and that there's going to be multiple tiers along the way where you're going to notice, hey, I'm keeping my Storm's Eye up buff, whether I'm in AoE or not. That Surging Tempest, I'm keeping that up. Great. Okay, well, but are you now using your Storm's Path? Because that's a huge DPS loss if you're not. Are you, using your Infuriates regularly? Because that's going to reward you for using those and using those correctly. Popping it when you have 50 or less gauge and reminding yourself to, within 30 seconds, cast that free Fell Cleave is awesome. So across the board, I feel like there's more positive feedback. A lot of these potency adjustments are something that would only be trackable through a very fast-moving abacus. And so I do feel that there's a fair bit of learning that we're going to do here when communities that seem to have a very, very fast-moving hand on a calculator use those, of course, against terms of service third-party tools to kind of break all of this down. I think Warrior across the board is a massive improvement. It's everything that I wanted. I was a little concerned about the gap closer change, but there are way too much positive here to be too concerned about that overall. I think that by far, Warrior is a winner going into Endwalker. I think there are going to be a lot of people that really enjoy Warrior that play it. Of course, I don't think there's going to be as many of those on day one, with everybody very interested in healers and in Reapers. And so I think that, and Summoners. So I think in general, Warrior will be a very, very rewarding job to play. I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what this does to my rotation overall. I'm not a rotation expert. I'm not on the high end. So if you are at this point and you are looking for the high end, what I would encourage you to do is go check out Rin's video. I'm going to try to have a link to that. Neither this video or that one at the time of this recording are obviously published. And so I'm going to try to have a link to that down in the description below. Or pinned in the comments, that will get you to Rin's video, where he will, of course, talk about rotations and things like that. I'm sure there will be others posted. That's just somebody that I've been bouncing back and forth in Discord as I was making this, looking at just how massive the changes are, and making sure that I'm really wrapping my head around this even remotely correctly. I'm very excited about this. I cannot wait to get into Endwalker and play my Warrior.